That poor old hag finally kicked the bucket, right?
I glared at him, anger simmering inside me. Ted, who had abandoned his blind mother to run off with his mistress. The way he spoke made it hard to believe he was the son of the kind Kimberly, and my anger reached its boiling point.
You must have had a rough time, right? Well, now you're free. Although someone your age hasn't much freedom left, do they?
Ted laughed crudely, but I hid my anger and smiled sweetly. Yes, I inherited $3 million, so I'll be enjoying my freedom from now on. The smug smile disappeared from Ted's face. Little did he know that soon he'd be apologizing to me, begging for forgiveness, something he likely couldn't even imagine at that moment. My name is Catherine. I'm currently 63 years old. I got married young and ended up living with Kimberly and Charles, who are my in-laws. I was blessed with kind Kimberly and Charles, but my husband, Ted, was a very disappointing person. I divorced Ted 10 years ago. At that time, I was 53 years old. My oldest daughter, Mia, was 18. My oldest son, Alex, was 15. It was a time when education costs were at their highest. On top of that, Kimberly was blind. Managing the kids' education and taking care of Kimberly, I don't think it was an easy life at all. I met Ted at work. When I joined the company at 18, Ted was 24, in his second year after college. He was a senior, and his dependable demeanor made me admire him. Ted was a caring person who helped guide me as I was still inexperienced. He was popular, but for some reason, he took a liking to me and asked me out. When our marriage was decided, I met Kimberly and Charles for the first time. Charles had trouble walking, and Kimberly was blind. I was deeply moved when I learned that Ted supported Kimberly and Charles while working. However, my parents opposed the marriage. They were worried that I would have a tough time marrying with caregiving clearly in my future. But Ted's parents were so wonderful. Being young, I pushed past my parents' concerns and got married. My parents were so angry at me for getting married without their blessing that they said they would cut ties with me, but I already had a new family. Youth is reckless. I wasn't afraid of anything. After getting married, I quit my job. I took on the caregiving and household chores so Ted could focus on his work. Kimberly and Charles were very grateful and treated me like their own daughter. They always expressed their gratitude and never forgot to be considerate of me. Though caregiving was challenging, it wasn't a burden for me, as I spent so much time with them. Ted worked late every day. I believed our family was doing well. One day, I ran into a former coworker at the grocery store on my way home. Naturally, the conversation turned to me and Ted. My coworker said,
Ted is such a great husband, always leaving work early because he's worried about you, Catherine.
I couldn't believe my ears. Ted always came home after 10 p.m. That was far from early. It had to be a mistake. But at that moment, I couldn't say anything and awkwardly agreed with a forced smile, saying, "Yes, that's right." When I got home, I mentioned it to Ted. I was looking for information. You've been coming home late recently. Can't you come home a little earlier? Charles feels bad having me help him all the time. At least you could help with his bath. But before I could finish, Ted yelled at me.
Are you kidding me? I'm working, not playing around. Tell your dad not to be so demanding.
Charles isn't saying anything. I just felt that way myself. Ted seemed to have no intention of helping with caregiving. On top of that, his reaction was overly defensive. I had a feeling my worst fears were coming true. But at that time, I couldn't bring myself to face it. I was terrified of what I might discover if I pushed him and found out something I didn't want to know. I had no home to return to after going against my parents to marry him. And I was also worried about Kimberly and Charles. So, in the end, I chose to continue living my days as usual. One day, I thought about buying an electric wheelchair for Charles. He was living with a cane and a regular wheelchair. But with an electric wheelchair, he could go for little walks. If I pushed Kimberly, who was blind, in her wheelchair, we could even go on longer walks together. I talked to Ted about it. I had no doubt he would agree. But his reaction was lukewarm.
Yes, we do.
Ted responded to my suggestion with a pained expression.
Just living off my income alone is hard enough. Do we really need to waste money on that?
It was true that we weren't wealthy. But if it made Kimberly and Charles even a little happier, I didn't consider it a waste. How about we take out a small loan from the bank and use their pensions to pay it back gradually? Ted reluctantly agreed and said, "Just don't make it my problem." I couldn't tell Kimberly and Charles exactly what Ted said. But when I positively mentioned that we could take out a loan, Charles was pleased. We went to the bank together, got a loan, and purchased the electric wheelchair. Kimberly and Charles were pleased with it. However, not long after that, Charles passed away. Kimberly and I were heartbroken. But
He just left us with debt. I told you we didn't need to buy it.
Ted muttered. I'm sure Kimberly heard him too. I felt incredibly guilty. At home, it was just Kimberly and me. Although Kimberly was blind, she could manage some things around the house. My caregiving duties were significantly reduced. Around that time, Ted suggested that we start thinking about having kids. I had once doubted Ted, but if he was bringing this up, it must have been a misunderstanding. Soon, we had 2 children together. Unfortunately, Ted didn't change even after the kids were born. He still neglected everything at home. I was just overwhelmed with housework and childcare every day. But amid it all, seeing Kimberly happy was my only solace. Kimberly couldn't see her grandchildren, but after Charles passed away, she fell into a deep sadness. With the birth of our children, the house was filled with lively voices every day, and I felt like Kimberly began to smile more often. We lived happily after that. But Ted continued coming home late, just as my coworker had mentioned long ago. I could never forget what he said during Charles's funeral. Ted showed no love for Kimberly or our kids. And even on his days off, he would leave, saying, "I'm going to work." The love I once had for him had faded. As long as he brought home money, that was enough for me. Our marriage was falling apart, but our children grew up to be kind and considerate. Things changed for our family one spring when our daughter was 18 and about to start college.
I'm going to work.
Even though it was Saturday and Ted was supposed to have the day off, I stopped him as he was about to head out. "You promised to take Kimberly to the hospital today." That was a promise he made a few days earlier. Today is Kimberly's health checkup, and it was also the day we were supposed to finalize the handover of the apartment where our daughter would live alone as a college student. Since we knew about these plans, I had asked Ted to take Kimberly to the hospital.
It's your job as a housewife.
Ted yelled at me. "But I told you today is Mia's move-in day. I need to go with her to set up the place so she can live there before classes start." Ted seemed to get just as angry as I did. I had never talked back or argued with him before. Ted, who had never seen me stand up to him, seemed to get even more agitated.
I never heard anything about that. I married you because I thought you'd care for those old folks since you didn't seem popular. You want me to take care of that older woman? If you really can't go, just let her go alone.
I was stunned, speechless. How could someone be so cruel? I had sensed that Ted was indifferent toward Kimberly. But letting Kimberly, who is blind, go out alone, that's just too cruel. It was beyond insulting for him to talk about me like that. Finding out now why Ted, who used to be so popular, chose to marry me made me feel utterly humiliated. Enough. That's all I said to Ted. I had given up on expecting anything from him. Satisfied that I didn't argue back, Ted said,
All right then, take care of the old lady and the kids.
and with that, Ted walked out the door and never came back. Ultimately, my daughter had to handle the apartment handover and buy everything she needed for her new life independently. Meanwhile, I took Kimberly to her health checkup. We somehow got through the day. Everyone noticed Ted hadn't come home, but no one said anything. A few days later, a letter arrived at the house. It was from Ted. There was no return address, just his name. Inside was a divorce form and a brief note. He wrote that he was going to live with his mistress. He also said he didn't want anything to do with the debts left by the old folks and that we should live our lives without him. I was exhausted. If this was how things would be, I'd be better off cutting ties with him completely. That's what I decided. Before filing the divorce papers, I told the kids and Kimberly about it. Kimberly was the most shocked.
I'm so sorry.
She kept saying through her tears, holding my hand tightly.
Thanks to you, Mia, and Alex, I've been so happy. But now that you're divorced, I'm just a stranger. I'll live on my own from now on. It'll take some time, but I'll move out.
Kimberly muttered those words. In response, I firmly told her, Kimberly, you're like a real mother to me, and to the kids, you're their only grandmother. You don't have to worry about anything regarding our future. Even after the divorce, We are still family. Let's continue living together just like we always have." Kimberly sobbed as she thanked me for those words. But it's not like I wasn't worried. Even though Ted was just an ATM to us, having him around made things more financially stable. Now he was gone. I desperately searched for jobs, but no one wanted to hire someone like me who had been unemployed for years. Both my daughter and son offered to work to help out. Just when I thought there was no other choice, Kimberly spoke up.
Don't worry. Go to college and high school as planned. Catherine, you don't need to work either. Everything will be fine as it is. Leave it to me.
We were puzzled by her words. But as Kimberly said, we continued living without any changes. In fact, we were living more comfortably than when Ted was around. I filed the divorce papers at the courthouse. Kimberly wanted to file a missing person report for Ted, but I didn't want to see him again. Still, Kimberly wanted to see her son, Ted, again. However, even after filing the report, Ted was never found. The four of us made many memories together, and about 2 years ago, Kimberly peacefully passed away to join Charles. In the end, she never got to see Ted again, since Ted was still Kimberly's son. I felt I had to notify him, but when we looked up his address, no one lived there anymore. So we had a small funeral and said goodbye to Kimberly with just the three of us. And now, here we are. Standing before me is Ted. I ran into him by chance while I was out shopping alone. At first, I thought it might be a mistaken identity and tried to ignore him, but Ted's gaze never left me. It was a good decision. Realizing this, Ted, now with a much younger woman by his side, called out to me.
Catherine, right? Still got that same gloomy look on your face.
"That's rude." The woman beside him giggled. It was clear they were mocking me, and I sighed in frustration. Just as I was about to walk past them, Ted said,
So, that poor old hag finally kicked the bucket?
His words stopped me in my tracks, and I glared at him. "Who are you talking about?" Ted sneered and replied,
You know who I mean. That blind old lady you were living with. I heard through the grapevine. You must have had a rough time. Well, now you're free. You cannot do much with that freedom at your age.
Ted burst into a crude, obnoxious laugh. His words pushed my anger to its boiling point. But if I let my anger show now, it would only play into his hands. I forced myself to hide my anger and smiled sweetly. Yeah, I inherited $3 million, so now I don't have to work and can enjoy my freedom. Thanks for your concern.
What?
The smug expression vanished from Ted's face. Well, take care. Ted stood there in shock. As I walked past him, he hurriedly called out to me.
Wait a minute. $3 million inheritance. What are you talking about?
What do you mean? It's exactly what it sounds like. Thanks for disappearing. It made the inheritance process go so smoothly without you. Ted's face turned pale at my words. I thought it served him right. He needed to understand just how shallow of a person he indeed was. He needed to understand just how shallow of a person he truly was.
Don't mess with me. I'm her son. I had yet to learn there was that much money. I'm entitled to a share too.
I smirked at his words. Sure, but you weren't around. You know, after you disappear and 7 years pass, you're legally considered dead.
What?
So, according to Kimberly's will, the inheritance went to me, our son, and our daughter. You don't have a leg to stand on. Ted had a foolish look on his face. I was almost laughable. After Kimberly passed away, I realized that she had planned all this when she asked me to file the missing person report for Ted. Kimberly had a substantial inheritance. A man claiming to be a lawyer showed up and explained everything to us. It turns out Kimberly's family were landowners. But just like me, Kimberly had cut ties with her family. Still, she had the right to inherit. When her parents passed away, she inherited it all without telling anyone. Thanks to her, we were able to live comfortably without any worries. I asked Kimberly just once, "Kimberly, how are you managing the money? If it's just your pension, you can spend it however you like." Kimberly responded,
I'm spending it exactly how I want to live happily with my family.
"That's what she told me." By the way, she spent the money. I knew it wasn't just her pension, but it was clearly her money. Since we were struggling, we gratefully accepted her generosity. The inheritance Kimberly received was far more than she could ever spend in her lifetime. But then Ted became an issue. If things continued, Ted would inherit everything if something happened to her. Kimberly didn't want that. She consulted with a lawyer, and around that time, Ted went missing. Kimberly believed that their ties were finally severed. Though sad to be apart from us, she thought she could move into a retirement home, use up her inheritance, and leave nothing behind. However, my son, daughter, and I insisted that Kimberly was family and that she should continue living with us. Kimberly was overjoyed. Wanting to leave her inheritance to us, she followed the lawyer's advice and filed a missing person report for Ted. According to the law, after 7 years, Ted was legally declared dead since he had left home. When Kimberly passed away a year later, her inheritance was passed on to our son and daughter instead of Ted. Even though I didn't have the legal right to inherit, Kimberly left a will that included me. That's how we were able to receive Kimberly's heartfelt gift. Ted, Kimberly covered all of Mia and Alex's tuition and living expenses after you left. Thanks to her, we were able to live happily. So thank you for leaving." Ted's face turned pale, and he opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. Serves him right, I thought. After that, Ted started contacting us, ranting about his entitlement to a portion of the estate. He hadn't been in touch for years, and now he was acting this way. It was despicable. There's no inheritance for someone who's legally dead, I told him repeatedly. But he wasn't satisfied and kept demanding a discussion. We sought advice from a lawyer. For Ted to claim the inheritance, he'd have to undergo various legal procedures, like reversing the missing person declaration. In cases like this, It's common for the grandchildren to inherit instead. We had no intention of giving Ted a single cent. I relayed the lawyer's message directly to Ted. He'd also have to pay the inheritance tax if he wanted to claim the inheritance. Ted fell silent when I told him he'd need to handle all that. The kids were present during the discussion as well.
I can't take time off work. I can only do some of that paperwork. An inheritance tax. I shouldn't have to pay for that. You all should cover my share. After all, you owe me for providing for you all those years, so it's the least you could do.
Ted's audacity left us speechless. He was currently working day-to-day jobs, and missing even one day would be a problem. He told us that his job while we were married ended in his firing for unapproved absences. When we asked why he left his job and was struggling financially, he revealed that he had debts from his previous mistress. He had been moving from place to place to pay them off, taking day jobs.
Try to understand.
He said, but I couldn't muster an ounce of sympathy. You ended things with that woman, didn't you? Then who was that person you were with the other day? Ted responded arrogantly.
She's the one I've been searching for all my life.
He was absurdly self-satisfied. Our son was struggling to hold back his laughter. Are you married to her? I asked.
No, it's only been 6 months since we met.
Ted muttered, almost under his breath. That was too much for our son, who finally burst out laughing. My daughter and I were at a loss for words, utterly exasperated by the man's foolishness. And what about the woman you left with when we divorced?
She said she couldn't make me happy and left me.
Ted said this casually, seemingly oblivious that he'd been dumped. Clearly, he had been jumping from one woman to another his entire life. You're an old man now. Stop acting like you're still young. I advised Ted, who was becoming more and more pathetic by the minute.
She's my soulmate.
I realized there was no point in saying anything more to him at that moment. After reuniting with Ted, we found out where he lived. He was living in an apartment in a nearby town under a woman's name. My son ended up buying the entire apartment building and became the landlord.
This is the money Grandma gave us. It would be a waste to just let it sit there. I thought it was better to invest in real estate.
Alex said. At first, I thought he was trying to help his father, but that wasn't the case. In fact, if the rent was even a day late, he would go to collect it. The previous landlord had been lenient, but my son was not.
Dad made life hard for you, Mom. He chose to live the way he does now, so he should struggle even more than you did.
Alex said, intending it as a punishment for his father. Ted had never done anything fatherly before. I'm sure the kids had their own thoughts about that. It seems he couldn't endure that kind of life any longer. Ted came to the house, apologized to me, and begged for forgiveness.
I'm really sorry. I was wrong to leave you responsible for caring for my parents and our children.
Seeing him like that made me sigh. Ted was desperate.
But I have my life now. Please ask Alex to give me a little more time to pay the rent.
Ted, on the verge of tears, pleaded. It must have been tough for him. I don't know. If you had at least been a good father to the kids, it wouldn't have come to this. A failed son, a failed husband, and a failed father. What do you have left in your life now? What was your life even worth? Think about that. Ted left without saying another word. His figure looked smaller than ever. Ultimately, after continuing to miss rent payments, Ted was forced to leave the apartment. He ended up in a 50-year-old building with drafty windows. He's still working day-to-day jobs to get by. The so-called soulmate he was with left him when he moved out of the apartment on the day we reunited. It turned out that Ted had been paying for everything. Ultimately, he couldn't even pay the rent and was forced to leave, which was inevitable. In fact, Ted should be grateful that she stayed with him for as long as she did. She was much younger, and like I once was, she couldn't see Ted for who he really was. Thanks to Kimberly, we're living a happy life now. As my son suggested, we invested in real estate and stocks. Now, we enjoy passive income and take trips every month. And my daughter is getting married. Her fiancé is kind and treats me well too. Our family and happiness will continue to grow. Having overcome a complicated past, we can now fully appreciate the happiness we have today. I savor that thought every day.